Welcome back everyone to episode 8. We're heading into part 3 now, and this one is all about the case statement. So let's head on in to SSMS. Alright then, let's change the database quickly and we are ready to go. So the case statement then, what is that all about? Now if you've used Excel and you've used the if formula, where you can say if a certain occurrence, a certain value equals a certain value, then you can basically put something else in, and if it's not equal to that value, if it's false, then you can put something else in there. So all the case statement is doing is saying when it's this situation, then you can put something in. When it's another situation, all you're doing is putting something else in. So if we have a look at this statement very quickly, it's one we've used many times before, sales and the invoices with a left join, so we can pull our orders and invoices which have not happened yet, but we've got all the orders anyway. So we know that we are getting some orders which haven't been invoiced, so there's some nulls creeping in there. So all you're doing with the case statement is you're starting it as a column, as a separate field within your select statement itself. Start it off with case, and that tells SQL Server to expect some conditions moving forward. So we begin our first condition with the word when, and we say in this situation, when the invoice ID is null, i.e. there's nothing in there at all, then, and that's how I say when it's this, then we want to output the word uninvoiced. And when it's not null, then we want to put the word shipped. So obviously in this situation we can only have two scenarios, is null and is not null. But obviously with the case statement you can have more than two scenarios, so you can keep on writing your when clauses there. But all we're saying is when this condition is true, then do this. When this condition is true, then do this instead, pretty much. And we then end our case statement with the word end. Very important, as you can see, it gives an error if we don't do that, and then we can name our column to whatever we want to name it to. Here's another one for you here with the case statement. All we're saying is when the invoice ID is not null, i.e. there is an invoice ID, then put in this value here, which is from the invoice lines table. So as you can see, we can hard code values, we can bring in columns, etc. And if another way to write this, if all else fails, so if the invoice ID is null, we can simply say else put 0. So if this condition is not met, no matter what the situation is, then we default to a 0. So we're going to put in 0 there if this condition here is not met at all. Finish with end, and we're going to name our column there. So let's have a look when we run it off at the results and see what's going on there. So as you can see, there is an invoice ID, so we say it's shipped, and of course if there's an invoice ID we get an invoiced amount there. And of course there's 4 different invoice IDs because there's 4 different lines, so there's a different invoice amount for each line there. Now as we scroll down the list, quite a few of these been shipped. We hit some where there's no invoice ID, obviously no invoice date, but we're checking to see if this is null. If it is null, then we put uninvoiced, and there you have it, invoice there. Now if invoice ID is not null, to put the extended price, in every other scenario, and in this case the invoice ID is null, we then put a 0 instead, as you can see there. Now another way to default a null if this condition is not met, or if all the conditions in your case statement are not met, you can simply leave the else off here. If you wanted to put in a null, for example, as we go down, you can see that it defaults to a null. So if there's no else catch-all value, we can of course put null like that, or just simply comment that out. So look for this condition here, and if that condition's not met, which it isn't on this row here, then it simply defaults to null there. So it depends what you want to do with the default value. Here I'm just going to put in a 0 instead. So there's quite a bit of flexibility with your case statement, and especially with bringing in nulls as well. Quite a lot going on there. So that's just one basic straightforward example for you. Now if we have a look at this second one here, you can see that the case statement is written slightly differently. All I've done is written case, and then I've put the column that we're going to look at directly after case. Here you can see I put case, but then it's blank, and I've put the condition we're going to look for in our when here. In this situation, which is a slightly simplified version, however it's very limited. So all you can do is say when 2, for example, if lead time in days is 2, then you return this here. When it's 3, then return that, and so on, all the way down the list there. So you can only specify when that is equal to that value, then you do that. You can't then start adding things in here. For example, stock pattern name equals that, then that. You can't do that. And that is one of the things about having the case statement, the column that you're going to look into directly after the case. You have to basically just specify when it's this, then do something else. There's no flexibility at all in the when clause. However, as you can see, very simple, very straightforward to write. And if you do have a situation where all you're doing is checking various conditions within a column, and one column, when it's equal to that, then do something else, then that's a very quick and easy way to write your case statement. If not, if you have to look at a variety of different conditions and possibly look at different columns within the same case statement, then you've got to write it like this here. Now we can simplify this even further using a few of our operators that we learned in previous videos. So for example, we can see that 2 and 3, they're both fast here. So all we can say, when lead time equals 2 or it equals 3, then we call it fast, which is easily done. As you can see, you can build up some quite complex things in here, comparisons, etc., in there, similar to what we've learned in previous videos, and simplify basically your case statement itself. Here, when it's 7, it's average, or we can say when it's in 12 or 14, then slow, so there's the N for you, and of course when it equals 20, extremely slow. So basically we're just merging these two together here. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. The problem with this approach, however, is what happens when we get a stock item that's input into the database and say it has a lead time of 4 or 5 or 6 or 8 or 10, for example. Obviously these conditions will not cover that, and of course we'll end up with a null in place of our supply speed. So here we go. If we select that, you can see that 14 is slow, 12 is slow. When you hit 7, we're talking about average. All the way down, 2 is fast down there. But what happens when we do get those values that aren't in here? Well, we can start to build in our betweens, our greater than, less than, equals to, etc., etc. So we can have a lot more flexibility. So what we can do is say when lead time is between 1 and 7, then we can call it fast. The lead time is greater than or equal to 8, or less than or equal to 14, which is exactly like saying between 8 and 14, then we can call it average. If it's greater than 14, but it's less than 22, so that's between 15 and 21, we'll call it slow. And here's our catch-all at the end. If none of these criteria are fulfilled in the case statement, we're just going to call it extremely slow. So here we had, execute that, 227 rows. And we'll do the same with this one. We'll run it off. Still got 227 rows. But as you can see, we've got similar values here on the supply speed. Got some, I'm sure there's an extremely slow in there somewhere, or maybe there isn't. But what this is doing is pretty much sort of future proofing your code, so that if any other value gets inputted that you haven't catered for within one of these case statements here, then it's not going to return a null, because anything between 1 and 22 or 21 will be taken care of with these bits of code, and our else will catch everything else. So anything from 22 and above on the lead time in days will be marked as extremely slow. It could be 100 days, it could be 1,000, it could be 1,000,000, but it will just be marked as extremely slow from there. And of course you can continue to build up as many whens conditions within your case statement. Just remember, beginning with case and ending with end. Now we can even use the methodology in the case statement to help us out even further. In this situation, because the case statement works from top down, so it'll look at the first condition, the first when, and if the lead time in days is less than or equal to 7, it will put in fast. And if it fulfills that condition there, it will simply ignore the rest and then go on to the next row. So if the lead time is less than or equal to 7, it will put in fast. If not, it'll then move on to the next one here. Is it less than or equal to 14? Yes. Let's put an average and ignore the rest. No. Let's move on to the next line then. Less than or equal to 21, it's slow. If not, then we use our catch all at the end. Let's have a look at that in action. There you go. Averages, you've got your fasts there, average, and then so on. You've got a slow in there as well. So a few slows, as you can see there. So that's even less writing that you've got there. See different ways I've put in green of doing the same thing, but this is an extremely small bit of code in comparison to all of these up here. Very simple to write, and we're leveraging the methodology that the way the case system actually operates. So main thing to remember is the order in which you do put your when clauses, because if we have a look at this one where it's reversed, we've got the 21 before the 14 and then the 7 at the end. If we have a look at that, you can see every single one of them is done as slow, because 7 and 14 and any value less than 21 will fulfill this criteria here. As we've only got values from 20 and below, every single one will fill this first criteria and then move on to the next. So they will never actually move on to the second line or even the third one here. So it's very important that when you're leveraging the way, the methodology that the case statement works, from the first check here, then the next one, then the next one, then your else, you need to make sure that it's in the right order. Otherwise, you may end up having to hard code things like this, which is not very dynamic or flexible going forwards. Now, what you can also do is embed case statements within other case statements. Now, obviously, you don't want to have 1,000 case statements within each other, otherwise it'll be a bit confusing. And I think there's also a limit, something like 50 case statements that you can embed within each other. Obviously, if you had to write that code and work on it, it would be extremely confusing. But what we can do is start off with our first case statement there, and here's our first condition. Now, what if we wanted to build in two different conditions that are reliant on this first one here? Well, after our then, we can then bang in another case statement there. So as with the one on the outside, where we start with a case and then an end, we simply do the same here with a case and an end. So what we're saying is, if the lead time is less than or equal to 7, it is, then we do this. We look at this case statement when the lead time days is less than or equal to 3. If it is, put in uber fast. If it isn't, then we default it to fast. However, that is only when the situation here is met. However, if it's not met, it'll skip this then case statement completely and move on to the next one here. If that's met, it'll do that and move to the next row in the database. If not, it'll move on to the next check here. Fails, if it's good, then it's slow. If it fails that one, we have our catch-all at the end. Let's have a look at that quickly. If you've got your averages, if we scroll on down, you've got your fasts, because that's 7. As we scroll down even further, you've got 2, and that's your uber fast there. So that's just another example of how you can embed one case statement within another, and it's useful in little situations like this. Obviously, you want to try and minimize all these embedding and also minimizing the amount of when clauses you have in there to keep your SQL code down, to keep it lean, and of course make sure when you execute your query it runs really efficiently. Right then, so we've learned all about the case statement, so let's move on with a little scenario. So you've been tasked by the data warehouse developer to help out with some code, simply to classify the transaction types. You need to include the transaction type ID, transaction type name, and add in a transaction group field based on the first word of each transaction type name. So effectively, you need to end up with 3 transaction groups, one called customer, one called supplier, and another called stock. And each of those need to be assigned correctly to each of the 13 rows that are returned. So, if you want to give that a go, give it a try, pause the video, and when you're ready to check your answer against mine, then we'll crack on and see how you went. First of all, we need to find out which table we're talking about. Transactions. Let's have a look at our tables then. White World Importers. Transaction types, there we go. Let's pull that in there and let's have a quick look at that. So as you can see, we've got the transaction type ID, we want that. Transaction type name, we want that. And then we need to build a transaction group field based on the first word of the transaction type here. Obviously we're going to pretty much hard code this. So let's bring in our fields. First of all, straight and easy, transaction type name. So we've got those, and then we need some sort of group. So how are we going to do that? Well, we need to check. We've got 3 situations here. Return three different values. So we're probably going to use a cheeky case statement to get all those values. Case. Can we put the transaction type name in there and then do our when? Probably not, as we have to do some sort of checks within the name itself to get these here. So I'm going to, as a safe bet, I'm going to put it within the first when, and I'm going to say when it is like customer, and then put in our %. So if it begins with customer and anything after that we're going to ignore, just as long as it begins with customer, then we're going to return the word customer. And of course you've got supplier and you've got stock in there. So let's just copy those and paste 3 in there. Probably don't need to put in an else, but you can. If you have done that, then that's not a problem. And we're going to call that transaction group. There you go. So we've got supplier. Here's the next one. And last but not least, we've got stock. So there you have it. If you've done this instead, then that's also fine. That will more than likely work. So let's have a look when we execute it, and there you go. There's our 13 rows. So we had starting with customer, all of these. You can see our group there, it's customer. These are all stock. Those are all stock. And we've got supplier there. Fantastic stuff. So we've returned everything for those 13 rows. Now, what happens in the future, and we always must be thinking about things that may occur in the future. What about if a new transaction type name popped in, which didn't begin with customer, supplier, or stock? Well, what we can do is simply put something along these lines. Maybe you put those in there to call attention to it. So if we ever run this query off again, as you can see, it's all fine with this. But say we didn't have this one here. If stock was a new one that had just been put in, then as you can see, we'd have missing there. But we fulfill the requirement with our code there, and if you got something along those lines and you got the same results when you execute it and you got those 13 rows, then that is all good. So that wraps up the part 3, the case statement there, and we've covered quite a few bits and pieces, to help you develop your SQL coding moving forward. And that brings us to the end of episode 8. Fantastic stuff. So join me for the next episode where we look into more fun and games with SQL. Until then, everyone, I'll leave you with this, and I wish you all a fantastic day.